The morning sun painted golden streaks across Boston's busy streets as people rushed to work, coffee cups in hand and phones pressed to their ears. But for 78-year-old Margaret Chen, this was the time of day she treasured most. Her wrinkled hands carefully arranged the steaming bamboo baskets on her small cart outside the public library, just as she had done every morning for the past 10 years. The smell of her handmade dumplings drifted through the air, making passers-by slow their hurried pace. Each dumpling was crafted with love, following recipes passed down through generations of her family. Many regular customers knew that inside each perfectly pleated wrapper was a story of tradition, hard work, and the American dream. Mrs. Chen had become a familiar face in the neighborhood. College students would stop by between classes, construction workers would line up during their lunch breaks, and even the library staff knew her schedule by heart. She kept her prices low, making sure everyone could afford a warm, delicious meal. What many didn't know was that she often slipped extra dumplings to those who looked hungry but couldn't pay. That particular autumn morning felt different somehow. The air was crisp and clear, but there was an unusual tension in the atmosphere. Officer James Barrett was new to this beat, having transferred from another precinct just 2 weeks ago. His polished badge gleamed in the morning light as he walked down the street, but his face wore a permanent scowl that made people step aside. Barrett had been having a rough time since his transfer. His marriage was falling apart, his teenage son wasn't talking to him, and now he had to patrol what he considered the messy part of town. Every street vendor, every makeshift stall, every informal business seemed like a personal offense to his idea of order. As he turned the corner near the library, his eyes locked onto Mrs. Chen's cart. The steam rising from her dumplings, the small crowd gathering around her stand, the handwritten menu in both Chinese and English. It all grated on his already frayed nerves. His fingers drummed against his belt as he watched her slow, careful movements while serving customers. What happened next would change not just their lives, but the entire community's perspective on power, kindness, and standing up for what's right. None of the morning regulars could have guessed that their friendly dumpling lady would become the center of a story that would touch hearts across the nation. And nobody, least of all Officer Barrett, could have predicted that one of the biggest names in entertainment would step in to turn this potential tragedy into a powerful lesson about humanity. Little did anyone know that just a few blocks away, John Cena was starting his day with a visit to the Children's Hospital. The wrestling superstar had a packed schedule of meeting young fans and bringing smiles to tired faces. He had no idea that soon he would be involved in a situation that would require a different kind of strength, the kind that comes not from muscles, but from the heart. As Mrs. Chen arranged her last batch of dumplings for the morning rush, she hummed a gentle tune from her childhood in Shanghai. She noticed Officer Barrett's approaching figure, but didn't think much of it. After all, she had all her permits in order, kept her area clean, and had been operating legally for years. But sometimes life has other plans, and this ordinary morning was about to become anything but ordinary. Officer Barrett's heavy boots scraped against the sidewalk as he made his way toward Mrs. Chen's dumpling cart. The morning crowd sensed something was wrong and began to step back, creating a small circle of tension in the usually peaceful space. His face was red and his jaw was clenched tight, signs that his regular morning frustrations had finally reached a boiling point. "Permits," he barked, not even trying to hide the anger in his voice. "Show me your permits right now." His sudden demand made Mrs. Chen jump slightly, causing her to drop the bamboo steamer she was holding. The sound of it hitting her cart echoed through the now quiet street. Mrs. Chen's hands trembled as she reached for the folder she always kept under her cart. She had been in America for 20 years, but moments like these still made her nervous, and her English would get tangled on her tongue. Yes, permit here," she said softly, pulling out the neatly organized papers she renewed every year. But Officer Barrett wasn't interested in being patient. He snatched the folder from her hands, papers flying everywhere in the morning breeze. These could be fake, he snapped, not even bothering to look at them properly. How do I know you're not selling illegal goods here? His voice got louder with each word, drawing more attention from passersby. A young college student who bought dumplings from Mrs. Chen every Tuesday tried to step in. Sir, she's been here for years. Everyone knows her. But Barrett cut him off with a sharp wave of his hand. Stay out of this, kid. This is official business. Mrs. Chen tried to explain, her voice shaking. Please, officer. All correct. I have health department paper, too. She pointed to the grade A certificate displayed proudly on her cart. But her gentle words seemed to make Officer Barrett even angrier. Maybe it was the stress of his personal life, or maybe it was something deeper, but something in him snapped. With a sudden movement that shocked everyone watching, he grabbed the edge of Mrs. Chen's cart and shook it violently. Steamers toppled over, sending the morning's fresh dumplings scattering across the dirty sidewalk. The hot water from the steamer splashed everywhere, and Mrs. Chen let out a frightened cry as she stepped back to avoid getting burned. Look what you made me do, Barrett shouted as if it was her fault. This is a hazard. You can't have hot water out here on the street. He kicked one of the fallen steamers, sending it rolling into the gutter. Mrs. Chen's life's work, her daily pride and joy, lay scattered and ruined on the ground. People started pulling out their phones, recording the scene. Some were calling the police department to report Officer Barrett's behavior, while others stood frozen in shock. Mrs. Chen's eyes filled with tears, but she stood as straight as she could, her dignity intact even as her small business lay in ruins around her. A mother quickly pulled her young daughter away from the scene, but not before the little girl called out, "Why is he being so mean to the dumpling lady?" The innocent question hung in the air, making several onlookers shift uncomfortably. Nobody had an answer for her. The situation was spiraling out of control. Officer Barrett seemed to feed off the crowd's fear and shock, growing more aggressive with each passing moment. He started throwing around threats about fines and arrests, his voice getting louder and his gestures more threatening. Mrs. Chen had backed up against the library wall, her small frame seeming to shrink even more as she tried to make herself as small as possible. Just when it seemed things couldn't get any worse, a shadow fell across the sidewalk. A large figure had stopped at the edge of the crowd, taking in the scene with growing concern. Nobody noticed him at first. All eyes were fixed on the unfolding drama between the angry officer and the frightened elderly woman. But in just a few moments, this unexpected observer would change everything about this situation, and his presence would turn the story of bullying into something very different indeed. John Cena was walking down the street, still wearing the bright blue Make-A-Wish t-shirt from his morning visit to the children's hospital. He had just spent hours bringing smiles to kids' faces, talking about never giving up and showing kindness to others. The irony of what he was about to witness wasn't lost on him. At first, he heard the commotion before he saw it, raised voices and the murmur of an uneasy crowd. As he got closer, the scene became clear through gaps between onlookers. What caught his attention wasn't just the overturned cart or the scattered food on the ground. It was the sight of a small elderly woman pressed against the library wall, trembling as a uniformed officer towered over her. Cena paused for a moment, taking everything in. In the ring, he knew exactly what to do. The moves were practiced, the outcomes planned. But this was different. This was real life, with real consequences. He watched as Officer Barrett kicked another steamer basket, his face red with unchecked anger. The crowd was growing larger, but nobody seemed to know what to do. Some were filming, others were calling for help, but fear kept them from stepping in. Cena noticed a group of kids watching from the library steps, their faces showing confusion and distress at seeing an authority figure acting this way. Something in Cena's chest tightened when he saw Mrs. Chen try to pick up a fallen dumpling basket, only to have Officer Barrett knock it from her hands. The woman's quiet dignity in the face of such bullying struck a deep chord. This wasn't about being a celebrity or a wrestler. This was about being human. Moving through the crowd felt like moving through water. People began to recognize him, whispers of, "Is that John Cena?" rippling through the onlookers. But Cena wasn't thinking about his fame or his image. His mind was on his own grandmother, who had faced similar prejudice when she first came to America. He thought about all the times she had told him, "Standing up for others is not a choice, it's a duty." As he approached, he could hear Officer Barrett's words more clearly now. The man was threatening to arrest Mrs. Chen, claiming she was resisting authority. The absurdity of calling this frightened elderly woman a threat would have been laughable if it wasn't so serious. Cena took a deep breath. He knew that rushing in aggressively would only make things worse. Despite his size and strength, this situation needed a different kind of power. He had learned over years of public appearances that sometimes the softest voice could carry the most weight. The crowd fell silent as Cena stepped forward, positioning himself not aggressively, but protectively near Mrs. Chen. His presence seemed to fill the space, not with threat, but with calm authority. Officer Barrett turned, his angry words dying on his lips as he realized who was standing there. "Hey there, officer," Cena said, keeping his voice steady and respectful. "Looks like we've got a situation here that's gotten out of hand. Maybe we could take a step back and talk about this." His words were careful, chosen to de-escalate rather than confront. Mrs. Chen looked up at her unexpected defender, confusion mixing with relief on her face. She didn't recognize the famous wrestler, but she could feel the shift in energy his presence brought. The officer's aggressive stance had faltered, caught off guard by this new development. Around them, phones were still recording, but now there was a sense of hope in the air. The story was changing from one of helplessness to one of courage, from despair to possibility. Nobody knew exactly what would happen next, but everyone could feel that something important was unfolding on this ordinary street corner. In this moment, John Cena wasn't a wrestling superstar or a celebrity. He was simply a person choosing to do what was right. And sometimes, that's all it takes to change everything. The tension in the air could be cut with a knife. Officer Barrett's face went through a range of emotions: confusion, recognition, and then something between embarrassment and defiance. He straightened his uniform, trying to maintain his authority despite the unexpected presence of John Cena. "This is police business," Barrett said, but his voice had lost its earlier edge. The same commanding tone that had terrorized Mrs. Chen moments ago now sounded hollow and uncertain. Cena nodded thoughtfully, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to the chaos around them. "I understand that, officer," Cena replied, taking another step forward. His voice was gentle but firm, like someone talking to a friend who'd lost their way. "And I respect your badge and what it represents. But right now, all these people are seeing something that doesn't represent the best of law enforcement." As he spoke, Cena bent down and started picking up the scattered bamboo steamers. His simple act of humility seemed to break something in the tense atmosphere. A few people from the crowd stepped forward to help, carefully gathering the spilled dumplings and cleaning up the mess. Mrs. Chen watched with tears in her eyes as strangers worked together to restore some order to her little corner of the world. She tried to help, but Cena gently guided her to sit on a nearby bench. "Please, take a moment to breathe," he said with a kind smile. Turning back to Officer Barrett, Cena shared something personal. "You know, my grandmother came to this country with nothing but hope and a few family recipes. She used to tell me stories about how scared she was, how sometimes people would treat her like she didn't belong." He paused, letting the words sink in. "But she also told me about the people who showed her kindness, who made her feel welcome. Those people changed her life." The crowd had grown quieter, hanging on every word. Even the kids on the library steps had crept closer to listen. Officer Barrett's hands, which had been clenched into fists, slowly relaxed at his sides. "I'm not here to make trouble," Cena continued. "I'm just asking you to look at this situation through different eyes. Mrs. Chen has all her permits. She's been here for years, feeding people, being part of this community. Maybe today could be about building bridges instead of breaking them down. A small girl, no more than 7 years old, tugged at her mother's sleeve. "Mom," she whispered loudly enough for everyone to hear, "he's just like you said. A real hero doesn't just fight bad guys, they help people be good." That innocent comment seemed to hit Officer Barrett hard. He looked around, at the spilled food, at the frightened elderly woman, at the disappointed faces in the crowd, and something in his expression changed. It was as if he was seeing his actions through new eyes. Barrett started, then stopped. His shoulders slumped slightly. "I've been having a rough time lately. But that's no excuse for." He gestured at the mess around them. "This isn't who I'm supposed to be." Cena stepped closer, placing a reassuring hand on Barrett's shoulder. "We all have bad days," he said. "The real measure of a person is what they do next." He glanced at Mrs. Chen, who was watching them both with wise, understanding eyes. The morning sun had risen higher now, warming the scene. Someone had brought Mrs. Chen a cup of hot tea from the coffee shop next door. Others were helping to set her cart right, arranging the few undamaged steamers. The atmosphere had transformed from one of conflict to one of community. In this moment, something powerful was happening. It wasn't just about stopping a bad situation. It was about showing how humanity and understanding could turn even the darkest moments into opportunities for growth and connection. The story wasn't over yet, but the path forward was becoming clearer with each passing minute. The next few moments would prove to be the turning point that nobody expected. As phones continued recording, Officer Barrett took a deep breath and did something remarkable. He walked over to Mrs. Chen, removed his cap, and bowed his head slightly. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice cracking with genuine emotion. "I let my personal problems affect how I treated you, and that was wrong." The simple words seemed to cost him a great deal of pride, but they came from an honest place. Mrs. Chen, showing the wisdom that comes from a lifetime of experiences, reached out and patted his arm gently. "Everyone has bad days," she said in her soft voice. "Tomorrow is new day." Her broken English carried more grace and forgiveness than any elaborate speech could have conveyed. The crowd watched in amazement as John Cena pulled out his phone and showed Officer Barrett something. A photo of his own grandmother on her first day as a U.S. citizen. She worked at a small restaurant too, Cena explained. Said it was the only way she knew to share love with her new community. Food brings people together, you know. As if to prove his point, one of the regular customers who'd helped clean up stepped forward. "Mrs. Chen's dumplings got me through my final exams last semester," she said. "Some days I couldn't afford lunch, and she'd always slip me an extra one, saying I needed strength to study." More stories started pouring out. A construction worker mentioned how Mrs. Chen would have hot dumplings ready at 6 a.m., knowing his early shift schedule. A librarian shared how she helped keep an eye on the street kids who hung around, making sure they had something warm to eat on cold days. Officer Barrett listened to each story, his face showing a mix of shame and understanding. The people weren't just talking about dumplings. They were describing the threads that held their community together, threads he had tried to tear apart in his moment of anger. The morning's events had drawn quite a crowd by now. Someone from a nearby coffee shop brought over fresh coffee for everyone. Another person returned with new bamboo steamers to replace the broken ones. The scene had transformed from one of conflict into something that looked more like a community gathering. John Cena, seeing the change in atmosphere, shared a story about his time traveling around the world. "You know what I've learned?" he said, addressing everyone but looking at Officer Barrett. "The strongest communities aren't built by force or fear. They're built by people like Mrs. Chen, one dumpling, one smile, one act of kindness at a time." A young boy who had been watching everything unfold tugged at his mother's sleeve and whispered something. She smiled and walked him over to Officer Barrett. The boy, holding his piggy bank, spoke up bravely. I want to help buy new supplies for Mrs. Chen's cart. His simple gesture brought tears to several eyes. The moment captured what was happening perfectly. This wasn't just about fixing a cart or replacing broken steamers. It was about healing the invisible breaks in their community. Officer Barrett knelt down to the boy's level, his eyes glistening. How about we start a collection together? I think I need to contribute the most. Mrs. Chen tried to refuse the help, saying it was too much, but Cena stepped in. Sometimes, he said with a warm smile, letting people help is its own kind of gift. It lets them show who they really are, who they want to be. The morning sun now bathed the scene in a warm glow, as if nature itself was approving of the transformation taking place. What had started as a story of conflict was becoming something else entirely. A reminder that even in our darkest moments, there's always a chance to turn things around, to choose a better path forward. By that evening, the videos of what happened outside the library had spread across social media like wildfire. People weren't just sharing the initial confrontation. They were sharing the remarkable transformation that followed. The sight of John Cena standing up for Mrs. Chen, and Officer Barrett's honest apology, touched hearts far beyond their small corner of Boston. Local news vans started appearing on the street, but instead of finding more conflict, they discovered something beautiful happening. The sidewalk around Mrs. Chen's usual spot had turned into an impromptu community gathering. People from all over the neighborhood kept coming by, each adding their own story about how the gentle dumpling lady had touched their lives. She gave my kids free dumplings when I lost my job last winter, one father told the cameras, his voice thick with emotion. Never made us feel like charity cases, just said good food makes hard times easier. Others nodded, sharing similar experiences of quiet kindness. The library staff brought out chairs, creating a small seating area where people could sit and talk. Someone had put up a handmade sign that read Community Corner, all welcome here. Children were drawing pictures of dumplings and steam baskets, taping them to the library windows in a colorful display of support. But what really caught everyone's attention was how Officer Barrett stayed throughout the day. He didn't hide from the cameras or try to avoid the attention. Instead, he listened to every story, shook hands, and spoke honestly about his actions. I forgot something important today, he told a reporter. I forgot that my badge means I'm supposed to be part of this community, not work against it. The story took another unexpected turn when some of Mrs. Chen's regular customers started a social media campaign. Using their phones, they shared years' worth of photos showing her small acts of kindness. The extra dumplings she'd slipped to hungry students, the way she remembered everyone's favorites, how she kept watch over kids waiting for their parents after school. A local business owner brought over a new cart, bigger and better than her old one. You fed our community for years, he said, helping to set it up. It's time we gave something back. Mrs. Chen tried to refuse, but the crowd wouldn't hear of it. The spirit of giving had taken over. As the sun began to set, someone noticed that Mrs. Chen hadn't made any sales all day. Her entire stock had been ruined in the morning's incident. Without missing a beat, John Cena announced he was placing an order for enough dumplings to feed everyone present the next day. But only if Mrs. Chen teaches me how to fold them properly, he added with a grin, making everyone laugh. The police department couldn't ignore what had happened. By evening, the chief of police had arrived personally. Instead of trying to minimize the incident, he listened to the community members who had gathered. This is how we learn and grow, he said. Not by pretending problems don't exist, but by facing them together. What started as a story about conflict had become a lesson in community healing. News outlets weren't just reporting on what went wrong. They were showing how people came together to make it right. Social media wasn't just sharing outrage, it was spreading hope. Young people who watched the videos saw something powerful. That standing up for what's right doesn't always mean fighting. Sometimes it means building bridges, listening to others, and being brave enough to admit when you're wrong. The story of the dumpling lady, the angry officer, and the wrestler who brought them together was becoming something bigger than anyone expected. A reminder that community isn't just a place, it's the choices we make every day. The days following the incident brought big changes to the police department. The chief took immediate action, announcing a full investigation into what happened. But unlike typical internal affairs cases, this one was different. It became about learning and growing rather than just punishment. Officer Barrett, instead of being simply suspended, asked to be part of the solution. "I want to make this right," he told his superiors. Not just with Mrs. Chen, but with the whole community. His honesty and willingness to change impressed everyone, even those who had been angry at his earlier behavior. The department scheduled mandatory cultural sensitivity training, but they did something unexpected. They asked Mrs. Chen to be part of it. She would come to the training sessions and share her story, how she came to America, built her small business, and became part of the community. Officers listened intently as she described her experiences, both good and bad, with law enforcement over the years. What touched many officers deeply was when Mrs. Chen brought homemade dumplings to share during these sessions. "Food brings people together," she said simply. "When we eat together, we learn to understand each other." The smell of her cooking filled the police station's meeting room, creating an atmosphere more like a family gathering than a formal training. John Cena's influence didn't stop with that one morning. He made regular FaceTime calls to check on both Mrs. Chen and Officer Barrett. During one call, he suggested something that would change everything. Why not have police officers spend time helping at Mrs. Chen's cart? It would give them a chance to interact with the community in a positive way. The idea caught on quickly. Officers began taking turns helping Mrs. Chen set up her cart in the mornings. They learned about her life, her family back in China, and her dreams for her grandchildren. More importantly, they saw firsthand how she treated everyone who came to her cart, with kindness and respect, regardless of who they were or how much money they had. Officer Barrett took his personal transformation seriously. He started attending counseling to deal with his anger issues and the stress that had been affecting his work. "I never realized how much I was carrying inside," he admitted during a department meeting. "It took nearly destroying someone else's life to make me see I needed help." The department also created new guidelines for handling street vendors and small business owners. They focused on building relationships rather than just enforcing rules. Officers were encouraged to know the people on their beat, not just their names, but their stories too. Community members noticed the change. The same phones that had recorded the confrontation now captured videos of police officers chatting with vendors, helping elderly residents carry groceries, and taking time to talk with kids on the street. These positive interactions started going viral too, showing how one incident had sparked real change. Mrs. Chen's story became part of the police academy training curriculum. New recruits would learn about what happened that day, not just as a lesson in what not to do, but as an example of how communities can heal and grow stronger through understanding and forgiveness. The most powerful moment came when Officer Barrett received his first performance review since the incident. His supervisor noted not just his improved behavior, but how he had become an advocate for change within the department. "You've turned a mistake into a mission," the supervisor told him. "That takes real courage." Through it all, Mrs. Chen kept making her dumplings, kept smiling at customers, and kept being the heart of her community. But now she did it with the knowledge that she had helped change not just one officer's perspective, but an entire department's approach to community policing. The healing process continued in ways nobody expected. One morning, Officer Barrett arrived at Mrs. Chen's cart carrying something special, a framed photograph of his own grandmother. He showed it to Mrs. Chen, explaining how she too had been an immigrant who worked hard to give her family a better life. "I forgot my own family's story," he told her, his voice soft with emotion. "My grandmother faced the same struggles you did. She worked in a laundry, barely speaking English, dealing with people who treated her like she didn't belong. The conversation between them was no longer about an officer and a vendor. It was about two people sharing their human experiences. Mrs. Chen listened, nodding with understanding. She pulled out her own worn family photos from a small box she kept under her cart. There were pictures of her first day in America, her children's graduations, and the day she got her business license. Each photo told a story of determination and hope. The regular customers who witnessed these morning conversations started bringing their own family photos and stories. Soon, the library wall near Mrs. Chen's cart became a community photo gallery. Pictures of grandparents, old family recipes, and stories of immigration from all over the world covered the wall. Each one added a new thread to the fabric of their community's story. Even the local schools got involved. Teachers brought their students to learn about different cultures through food and stories. Mrs. Chen taught kids how to fold dumplings, while Officer Barrett shared lessons about respect and understanding. The children's innocent questions and eager participation brought fresh energy to these gatherings. One particularly touching moment came when Officer Barrett's teenage son, who hadn't spoken to his father in months, saw the viral videos of his dad's transformation. He showed up at Mrs. Chen's cart one morning, wanting to understand the change in his father. Mrs. Chen, with her usual wisdom, sat father and son down with a plate of dumplings between them. "Food helps words come easier," she said, stepping back to give them privacy. That morning marked the beginning of healing, not just for the community, but for Barrett's family too. His son started joining him during his shifts, helping at Mrs. Chen's cart, seeing his father in a new light. The local art community joined in too. A mural appeared on the library wall, showing hands of different colors sharing food and stories. At the center was a small dumpling cart with steam rising up, transforming into doves, a symbol of peace and unity that made Mrs. Chen tear up when she first saw it. Cena kept his promise to learn dumpling making from Mrs. Chen. Photos of the wrestling star carefully folding dumplings under her patient instruction went viral. But what meant more was how he kept coming back, not for publicity, but because he had become part of this extended family. The change in Officer Barrett was remarkable. His colleagues noticed how he handled stressful situations differently now. Instead of reacting with anger, he found ways to connect with people. "Mrs. Chen taught me that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is show kindness," he would say during police training sessions. Local business owners started a weekly community dinner, taking turns hosting. Mrs. Chen's dumplings were always the star attraction, but now they shared space with dishes from around the world. These dinners became a place where people could share not just food, but their hopes, struggles, and dreams. Through it all, Mrs. Chen remained unchanged in her gentle ways, but her impact had grown far beyond her little cart. She had become a symbol of how grace and forgiveness could transform not just one person, but an entire community. 1 year after the incident that changed everything, Mrs. Chen's corner looked very different. Her simple cart had grown into a small food stand, decorated with strings of tiny lights and surrounded by blooming flowers planted by community members. But the biggest changes weren't the physical ones. They were in the hearts of everyone involved. On the anniversary of that fateful morning, the community organized a special celebration. People gathered early, bringing chairs and tables to set up in front of the library. The same spot that had once seen conflict now hosted a festival of unity. Officer Barrett was there, not in his uniform, but in an apron, helping Mrs. Chen prepare dumplings for the crowd. Cena made a surprise appearance, arriving with boxes of special t-shirts he had designed. They featured a small dumpling cart with the words "Small Acts, Big Changes" written beneath it. The money from the shirt sales would go to a new community fund, helping other small business owners get their start. The police chief stood up to make a speech, but what touched everyone was when he stepped aside to let Mrs. Chen speak instead. Her English was still broken, but her words carried wisdom that needed no translation. "1 year ago, we learned an important thing," she said, looking at the gathered faces. "We learned that love's stronger than anger. We learned that good people can make mistakes, and mistakes can lead to beautiful things. Officer Barrett's transformation had inspired other police departments across the country. He now traveled sometimes, sharing his story and the lessons he'd learned. But he always made sure to be back for the morning rush at Mrs. Chen's stand, helping her set up before starting his patrol. The library had created a special program called Stories Over Steam, where people could come share their family histories while learning to make dumplings. Mrs. Chen's recipe cards, written in both English and Chinese, became treasured possessions in many homes. But she always said the secret ingredient wasn't in the writing, it was in the sharing. Children who had witnessed the original incident had learned powerful lessons. A group of middle school students created a project about how their community had changed. They interviewed Mrs. Chen, Officer Barrett, and many others, creating a documentary that won a local film festival. Their simple message: change starts with one person choosing to be kind. The photo wall had grown so large that the library gave it a permanent space inside. They called it the Unity Gallery, and it became a popular spot for school field trips. Teachers used it to show how one small corner of the city had become a model for positive change. On this anniversary day, as people shared food and stories, something beautiful happened. Mrs. Chen taught Officer Barrett's entire family how to make her special dumplings. Watching them work together, laughing at folding mistakes and celebrating perfect pleats, you'd never guess their story had started with conflict. As the sun began to set on the celebration, John Cena raised his glass of tea for a toast. "A year ago, I thought I was just stopping something bad," he said. But Mrs. Chen and Officer Barrett taught us all something important. They showed us that when we choose forgiveness over anger and understanding over fear, we don't just solve problems, we build something better. Mrs. Chen's Corner had become more than just a place to get delicious dumplings. It had become a symbol of hope, a reminder that even the darkest moments could lead to light if people were brave enough to choose a different path. Her small cart, once nearly destroyed in anger, had helped build a community where everyone felt they belonged.